Welcome to the final V lecture for Philosophy 225. Any human life includes a future, a present, and also a past. The past is easy to forget about. The past is easy to overlook in thinking about good life. What are the possible contributions of the past? What are the ways in which I might relate to my past? Our recent author, Martin Heidegger, envisions a profound rootedness in a shared past he calls the homeland. Joan Baez also has proposals about the past, and her proposals are valuable because Joan Baez in the late 1950s and early 60s participated in the folk music movement, playing and recreating songs from past generations and past centuries. However, in chapter 6 of the 1987 autobiography, Joan Baez indicates she no longer identifies with the folk movement, and she also provides several statements about nostalgia. Arguably, the folk movement was a nostalgic movement. Let's hear her statements about nostalgia. The first statement is at the very end of Daybreak on page 157. Joan Baez has described for us the house she built in California in the 1960s. Joan Baez writing, "How exquisitely sad these memories, and what foolish agony to try to hold on to them. For they are like the most vivid of beautiful dreams, which, even as they are fading inevitably into the past, overshadow the glories of the present with silly sadness and useless longing." Let's now look at the preface of the 1987 autobiography, again a reference to nostalgia. Joan Baez writing, "I am only 45 years old, active, creative, in vocal prime, and do not wish to be relegated to obscurity, antiquity, or somebody else's dewy-eyed nostalgia about days gone by." Joan Baez, of course, was a member or participant in many important cultural events in the 1950s and 1960s. And so for many people, she's somebody to turn to about those past events, but she's perhaps ready to move on. Here's another statement from the song Diamonds and Rust, which is, I think, largely about nostalgia. This was published in 1975. Joan Baez writing, "10 years ago, I bought you cufflinks. You brought me something. We both know what memories can bring. They bring diamonds and rust." Here she's describing her relationship with Bob Dylan. Let's first define nostalgia, and we'll hear the argument by Joan Baez why nostalgia ought to be avoided, and finally her proposal that we ought to examine the past. And this proposal is given very briefly at the end of the preface of the 1987 autobiography. Okay, first, defining nostalgia. First, let's hear some ideas about nostalgia. For many people, nostalgia is particularly about childhood. We wish to be back with our family, or in a childhood home, or perhaps in our childhood we were most happy. Many people are nostalgic about past sweethearts, or ultimately many people are nostalgic about college and the friendships and how they felt in life at college. It's possible also to be nostalgic about our shared past. Some people are nostalgic about, for example, the 1960s or the 19th century, and in some ways want to emulate or return to those time periods. And it's also possible to be nostalgic about another person's past or the past of another culture. Being nostalgic involves, of course, some kind of knowledge or curiosity about this past, but ultimately it involves like a wish to belong to the past, a wish to return to the past, or for the past to return. And nostalgia isn't simply a one-time phenomenon, it's often an ongoing characteristic of a person. So in short, nostalgia is a kind of habit. In fact, for Joan Baez, a bad habit. So let's hear a proposed definition of nostalgia, and this is inspired by virtue ethics more so than from what Joan Baez says. Nostalgia is the bad habit of dwelling on and belonging to the past to the exclusion of the present and the future. In short, when I am nostalgic, I think of the past as superior to today, or I think of good life as being in the past as opposed to the present or the future. Joan Baez provides some argument why nostalgia ought to be avoided, and much of these arguments are given in the statements which we've already looked at together. First argument, or first reason, when we're nostalgic, we overlook the present. We overlook the people around us, the people who are available to us. We look past opportunities because of our wish to belong to the past, whether personal or shared. Also, according to Joan Baez, the past is always retreating. Ultimately, the past becomes inaccessible to us. So if I am nostalgic about the past, I am ultimately going to be frustrated. I may succumb to, she says, foolish agony or despair. So we want to avoid despair. In 1968, Joan Baez says she's committed to social justice and to human rights. Those are for her priorities, so she can't afford to be nostalgic about her past life living in her house in California. And finally, a very good reason we ought to not be nostalgic about the past. This is given in the song Diamonds and Rust. Often we have a false concept of the past. We overlook the flaws that were in the past, whether it was a personal situation or whether it was a shared past like the homeland. Perhaps our concept of the past is obscured by prejudice. So in the song Diamonds and Rust, Joan Baez says, looking back on the past, yes, I loved you. There was a diamond that formed between us, but there was also rust, and she remembers the rust. So she's not going to be nostalgic about that past. She doesn't want that past to return. There's another possible bad habit about the past, and that is simply being oblivious of the past and forgetting the past. And Joan Baez doesn't argue that we should just simply be oblivious about the past. Instead, in the preface, she proposes, at least for herself, to examine the past. We might regard this as like a Socratic proposal about examining my life. Joan Baez emphasizes the value of examining her past. And let's read where she states this on page 13. Of the preface. And this is where Joan Baez is explaining why she writes an autobiography. Third and most important, I'm recording them, my memories, for myself, to take a hard look back before facing forward in these most bizarre times. Joan Baez's examination of her past is clearly an intellectual activity, and it's very similar to Martin Luther King's proposal to be tough-minded. Tough-mindedness is the virtue of experts who seek the truth. So Joan Baez looks into the past to find the truth. And in particular, she states she examines what came together in the past, what threads came together of her life, and what threads fall apart. And with this knowledge, she is then prepared to meet the future. In other words, she can now make informed decisions about what possibilities are fruitful and what are the possibilities to avoid. Joan Baez, having many friends and affiliations throughout the world, must constantly have to consider invitations and proposals. So knowing what failed in the past will be very important to her. So we have now two possible relationships to the past: Martin Heidegger's profound rootedness in the past and Joan Baez's intellectual examination of her own past as a way of meeting the future.